Looking for a fun way to store your Christmas treats this year? Well, then this video tutorial will be perfect for you. Join Martin as he guides you through making our Santa treat box. For all the details on this month's KISS project, please read the description of this video.
This Santa treat box is a very simple little box. It's got a few limbs that are hanging out from the bottom edge of it, so let's go and make these first. First we'll start with his boots. We're going to stitch the outline or the perimeter stitching lines now onto our stabilizer. We're going to put a little bit of batting down. We're making the pair of boots in one go. We're stitching through our batting. Then we'll remove the hoop and we'll trim 1 to 2 millimeters back to the perimeter stitching line. Let's create a placement line for our next piece of fabric. We're going to do the top of the boots. Place our fabric over the placement line covering all of the stitching and then stitch each of the elements. This holds our fabric taut. We've trimmed off the bottom edge of this piece of fabric, which is fabric A. Let's do the placement line for our bottom of our boots. Stitch this fabric into position, and then we start with some of our embroidery detail. Trim that top edge of that second fabric off. Going to be stitching the stripes on his tops of his boots, and then some stippling on both boots. This is the cuff of the boots. Love the way this stitch looks like fur. Our eyelets and our holly. Now we're going to place the lining on top, right side down, because we're going to stitch around the edge of these boots and then we're going to turn it through and trim them, and they'll be completed units ready to be caught into the seam of the treat box. So first of all we do a single running stitch to actually keep the fabric in place, and then we go back and do a triple stitch, which secures the seam in preparation for cutting and trimming. Once this stitching is finished, we're going to remove from the hoop and then trim a shy 1/4 of an inch around the outside edge, leaving a 1/2 an inch at the top, and then we'll turn it through and press. We've made the boots and there are the arms. Right, let's go ahead and make his face. We're not going to show you the video of making the side panels, etc. It's self-explanatory, it's quite simple. Just the detail ones we're going to show you. So his face, we've got our batting down, and we're going to now stitch his pink cheeks. The rosiness of his cheeks, which is quite an open straight stitch, is a great fill. Follow the diagrams and the notes about what stage and what suggested colour will be for creating the eyes, stitching his glasses. I love watching eyes actually in embroidery. It just makes the whole project come alive. Stitching on his moustache. So you could actually use contrasts of several contrasts of white for this. You don't have to use grey. This outline or perimeter stitching line is for his beard. If my white fabric was too transparent or slightly opaque, I would put a second layer underneath it so as you couldn't see any of the detail coming through. Quite safe with this one, it was thick enough. And now we're going to do the beard. So it's the stippling to look like his beard. His mouth and lips. And his little nose. Now we're stitching the brim of his hat. Again, I've actually used the same fabric so it ties on the moustache, and now the red for his hat. Trim back that inside edge back to a 1 to 2 millimeters away from the stitching, but make sure you leave enough fabric outside the seam so they can be joined together. This is a great little design. There's his pom-pom down the end of his hat. And we're going to stitch the placement lines for where the limbs go. So we've got his front arms and hands go onto these placement lines. See, that's where so they'll go face down, line on top of line, and they'll be stitched in. So we stitch them into the seam allowance before we actually start putting the box together. So here's our layout. So we've got our head, our back, our two sides, and that black is supposed to look like his belt, and those lines on the sides are his little portly tunic, plain base. So we're going to start by joining these together. So pin in corner to corner. We pop the pin into our mat so it stays in place, and then you pin across it so as it stops from moving, and that gets our corner point into position. So we're going to use the same technique, sewing to the net. Now sewing to the net means that we are sewing from the start to the end. We're reverse stitching or back stitching, but we're only sewing to the seam allowance. We're not sewing past it or into it, so that's called sewing to the net. It allows the seam allowance seam to be free. So we're going to do the same thing here. So we have our 3 sections, and these pieces are free because we haven't sewn into the seam allowance. We've stopped and started at the perimeter stitching. So we're going to sandwich our legs in between these two panels, which have been already stitched on. So we're going to find corner to corner. Poke the last corner stitch into the last corner stitch. And pin across. Then we're looking at seam on seam. Right. So there we have it. That's going to be the same for that top one as well. We're sewing to these points. So from this side, from point to point, back stitch and sew to the net so as that none of those seams are caught. They are all still free. And we'll do the same now with this head. Then we'll have our box being formed. So we'll just need to do our corner seams. with his arms and legs stretched out. It's almost like making Super Santa. So there we have it. So this is the formation of the box. I'll just quickly pop some clips in to show you how this forms. It's very simple. It's our same self method that we've done with all our boxes and our little tidies and holdalls. And there we have it. So, clip the seam together. And then the diagonal seam together. Point to point. And from there to there, pull those seams down, we're sewing to the net. Pull those seams down, sewing to the net. So once we've sewn these, and we're stopping at that corner so those seams are free, just sew as they point out and give you a nice corner. Not binding, no hole, it's just very, very easy to do, very easy to stitch. Again, clip and then stitch these seams. So we're not going to get the same original flat shape, it's going to be slightly dimensional shape once those seams are clipped together. It cannot lay flat. Okay, so we're going to sew those seams. Okay, so you can see I've started and I've not gone into the seam allowance. I'm coming down, I'm sewing in between those two lines and all my seams are free. Pull that corner piece down and then sew to our last stitch, reverse and reverse. And that's how we sew that seam, so as it's nice and firm but not tight. Just we need to check to make sure that we don't have any of the perimeter stitching showing on the outside. Can very easily happen. Check all our corners, and then we want to open these seams up. And turn through, turn through, turn through. This is quite a fast little project to actually put together. Give those corners a decent push out. And we'll be pressing those flat at a later stage. And there we have our box. So we're face on the front with his arms and hands and then our legs sticking out the back. Now, lining. Each of our squares has a cut of square lining cut for it, so they are matching perfectly in size. You'll see I've got a strip of interfacing at the top edges of each of the four around the outside, and the inside one, the centre one, the base panel, I've stay stitched around the edge so as I've got an idea of my seam allowance width. Now we need to leave a gap, so we're going to have to pin this seam, and we're going to be sewing only for an inch or so either side to leave a gap to pull the work through, but we do need to have a gap in that base seam so as we can pull the work through, otherwise it will be all enclosed. Sew the seam same way as we did with the outside shell of the box. So sew them all together, sewing to the net. Now that interfacing stops that top edge from stretching, so it's really important to have a light piece of interfacing. So there we have our hole there, and we are sewing to the net so we don't have any of the stitching into the seam allowance. And we're going to sew these well, once we've pressed, we need to press, and then we're going to sew these corner seams. So fold over, sew and sew. Make sure that those seams are down when we finish that seam there, just like we did with the outside shell. Again, all seams pushed away. Okay, so we've sewn those, and let's do the remaining two. So, once we have this all done, you can press those seams open if you wish to. We're going to put our lining inside out and our box is right side out, and we put one inside the other. It doesn't matter where your lining base gap is. It doesn't really matter where it is, which seam it is. It has no bearing on how this is finished. So seam on seam, and then one clip in the middle, seam on seam, one clip in the middle. Now your lining will feel slightly tight because we have the stabilizer on it, but that's fine, because if we don't have it slightly tight, it's going to be a very full looking lining, and we don't want that. It's be full enough as it is, even though it has been cut the same. It's still going to be quite full, so don't worry if it's a little bit tight. You'll see I'm going to be easing this in as I'm stitching. So just the top edge, we're sewing in between those two lines, which is the perimeter line and the batting line. Edges flush together, seam on seam. All the way around. Just make sure those seams are sitting on top of each other. Almost finished. Right, so just check the rest so we've got no seams folded over. I'm going to remove just the bolt from the top edge seam allowance from the outside shell of this box, so the one that's got the embroidery on it. Just going to remove those little corners. Just makes it a little bit thinner when we do our final stitch around the edge on the outside. Just remove those little corners of the seam. Now we're going to find the base and pull it through. Excuse the phone and the photos. We are taking photos for the notes as we are filming, because we're making one sample. So every now and again you'll see us stop, so we take a photo, hence there. Just be patient. Right. So we're almost there. Let's pin this gap together and then edge stitch it closed. Okay, so that's been closed. Let's see, this gets pushed into the bottom. See, edge stitching. And then we're going to roll our lining to the inside. I usually clip that round for the first two sides, and I give it a press, then I clip it again. Clipping with using a quilt clip, not scissors. And I just do two sides, and then I go to the iron and give it a firm press, and I do the next two sides. So I'll press this. Now, with the right side of the box facing up, and I'm using a straight stitching foot, we just want us to edge stitch around that top edge to keep it nice and firm. Can't even see my stitching. I'm using a matching thread. Using actually an embroidery thread. You can barely see my stitching. We're coming around to the end. We just want to stitch over it for a few stitches and trim off our tails. Turn it through again, and we have finished. Just needs to have a final press and I generally press those corner seams. I give it a light press so as they sit quite sharp. It's a great little fun project, it really is. So Santa's treat box.
Folks, that's a wrap on our Santa treat box project. I hope you had fun and feel inspired to fill your box with sweet treats this upcoming holiday season. If you'd like to connect and share your creations, join our friendly community linked below. For more exciting DIY ideas and inspiration, be sure to visit swpea.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you for our next KISS project.